Welcome to Fireside History, where the past comes to life. If you enjoy this retelling, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to hear more. The Battle of Berlin, 1945. World War II. In April 1945, Berlin was no longer a city in the usual sense. Not a capital, not a refuge, not even a place. It was a wound, an open sore on the landscape of Europe, raw and festering, awaiting the final blow. Smoke drifted like fog through the shattered streets. Power lines dangled like jungle vines over piles of rubble. The air smelled of dust, oil, and something harder to name, something burnt and ancient, a sense of ending. Every distant rumble of artillery sounded like fate tightening its grip. And that grip belonged to the Red Army. Berlin was about to pay the bill for the war it had unleashed, and it would pay in blood, brick, and fire. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing from all directions. To the west, the Americans, British, and Canadians had smashed through the Rhine. Patton's tanks roared across Germany's heartland. Eisenhower's armies capturing bridge after bridge, town after town. But it wasn't the Western Allies who were closest to Berlin, it was the Soviets, and they were coming fast. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commander of the First Belarusian Front, was driving hard toward the capital from the east. Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front pushed up from the south. Behind them, more than 2 million Soviet soldiers, backed by 6,000 tanks and nearly 9,000 aircraft. It was the largest offensive the world had ever seen, and it had a singular, unmistakable goal. Berlin. Stalin wanted it, needed it, not just as a strategic target, but as a symbol, to plant the red flag in the enemy's nest, to end the war with a Soviet hand around the Nazi throat. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Encircle Berlin, crush its defenders, occupy the city. No compromise, no retreat, no mercy. But Berlin wasn't unguarded, not yet. Even as the Allies closed in, Hitler refused to abandon the city. From his underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, he issued delusional orders to armies that no longer existed. Units that had been destroyed weeks ago were still being repositioned on his maps. He was living in a fantasy, a madman in a concrete womb. Outside, what remained of the German military was being patched together into a last line of defence. Army Group Vistula, under the command of General Gotthard Heinrici, one of Germany's most experienced pragmatic commanders, was given the impossible task of halting Zhukov's advance. But Heinrici knew better than to throw lives away in blind resistance. Instead, he made a choice: to withdraw from forward positions and concentrate forces along the Seelow Heights, a ridge 90 kilometers east of Berlin, overlooking the flat Ogda River plain. It was there the Soviets would come, and it was there the last real defence of Berlin would be made. At 4 a.m. on April 16th, 1945, the night sky turned to day. Soviet artillery, more than 22,000 guns and rocket launchers, opened fire across the Oder front. It was one of the greatest bombardments in military history, a ceaseless drumbeat of high explosives that shook the ground for miles. The Katyusha rocket batteries screamed like banshees, leaving trails of smoke that curled in the air like giant claws. In the confusion, waves of Soviet infantry surged forward across the flooded lowlands. But Heinrici had pulled his lines back, leaving the initial Soviet bombardment to fall mostly on empty trenches and decoy positions. It was a calculated move, and a deadly one. As the Soviet troops hit the real German defences on the ridgeline, the cost became clear. Machine gun fire erupted from camouflaged bunkers, Anti-tank shells punched through T-34s and IS-2s, heavy tanks. Fields were mined. Every crossing point was covered. It was slaughter. In the first 24 hours, Zhukov's men lost over 10,000 soldiers. Thousands more lay wounded in the mud and reeds of the Oder. But the Soviets did not stop. Zhukov, under immense pressure from Stalin to take Berlin before Konev, threw more and more men into the breach. Infantry battalions were reduced to companies. Tanks rolled forward over the corpses of their comrades. Bridges were repaired under fire. And inch by inch the German line buckled. For the soldiers on both sides, it was hell on earth. Sergeant Vasily Antonov, Red Army, 25 years old. I remember the sound more than anything, the roar of artillery, the crack of rifles, the scream of wounded men. We had to walk over the dead, just to keep advancing. There was no time to stop, no space to breathe. Just forward, always forward. He carried a PPSH 41 submachine gun, a drum-fed weapon that spat out bullets in short, vicious bursts, light, reliable, and deadly at close range. Antonov had once loved poetry. Now he only remembered verses that rhymed with death. On the German side, Corporal Hans Keller, 17, manned a machine gun in a trench overlooking the Oder. They came like a wave. We fired until the barrel glowed red. My loader, Karl, he didn't even cry when the shell hit him. He just looked surprised. Then there was nothing left. Hans was using an MG-42, the Hitler's buzzsaw, they called it, a weapon of fearsome rate of fire, over 1,200 rounds per minute. It tore through Soviet ranks like paper, but it wasn't enough. By April 19th, after 3 days of meat grinder combat, the Seelow Heights fell. The road to Berlin was open. In Berlin, the mood shifted from fear to something darker, resignation. Inside homes and shelters, the citizens waited. Some packed suitcases, others drank, some prayed, but most simply waited. Lieselotte Brandt, a 32-year-old mother of two, kept her children in the U-Bahn tunnels beneath the city. She wrote in her journal, "I keep them wrapped in blankets. They do not speak much. The eldest, Friedrich, asked if the Russians will bring food. I didn't know what to say." Above them, anti-aircraft guns pounded the sky, more for symbolism than effect. The city's defences were a patchwork of regular army, Waffen-SS, and hastily conscripted Volkssturm units. Old men and teenage boys handed rifles and armbands. Some had never fired a shot before. Others were veterans of the Eastern Front, gaunt and glassy-eyed. They built barricades, dug tank traps, planted explosives at intersections. But deep down, they knew. They were preparing a grave, not a defence. On April 21st, Soviet shells began to fall on Berlin. For the first time since the war began, the German capital, untouched for most of the conflict, was under direct, sustained artillery fire. Buildings collapsed. Fires spread. Glass rained from the sky like ice shards. The sound was unlike anything the civilians had known. Not like the distant hum of bombers, but the thunder of immediate death. Red Army vanguard units began to enter the outskirts. Panzerfaust teams waited in alleyways. Single-shot anti-tank launchers wielded like oversized pistols. The blast of a successful hit could send turret lids flying 30 feet into the air. But the price was enormous. Every destroyed Soviet tank came with a dozen comrades lost. Every street was a battlefield. Every building a fortress. The fighting in the suburbs, Lichtenberg, Neukölln, Pankow, began, and it was only the beginning. The outer districts of Berlin had become a battlefield. But this was something else. This wasn't war as generals imagined it. with sweeping manoeuvres or elegant flanking actions. This was intimate, brutal, primitive. It was street to street, room to room, hand to hand. Men fought with bayonets, pistols, spades, anything they could grip. There were no front lines now, only intersections and doorways. The chaos swallowed whole neighbourhoods. By 23rd April, Soviet forces had encircled the city. Berlin was a trap. Nothing and no one could get in or out. The noose had been drawn, and it was tightening. Inside the Reich Chancellery bunker, reality was slipping away. Adolf Hitler, pale and trembling, shuffled between rooms like a spectre. His left hand shook uncontrollably. He refused all suggestion of evacuation. When told the Soviets were within kilometres of the city centre, he barked orders to phantom divisions, the Steiner counterattack that would never come. His closest followers watched in silence. Some still believed. Most did not. Himmler had fled. Goering was plotting his own surrender. Berlin and the man who ruled it were unravelling. The Volkssturm, men as old as 70 and boys as young as 14, manned makeshift barricades behind overturned trams and burned-out cars. SS units, hardened on the Eastern Front, held strongpoints in government buildings, museums and schools. Some streets became impassable, clogged with debris, wreckage and bodies. Tank battles erupted in courtyards. Snipers moved between shattered attics. At night, flares turned the sky a ghostly orange. Smoke drifted like mist. The air was heavy, one with soot, with sweat, with fear. The sound of the MG-42 echoed constantly, the furious high-pitched snarl of its 1,200 rounds per minute, mowing down Soviet charges like a buzzsaw through timber. Soviet tanks advanced in tight packs, T-34s, 8s-5s and the fearsome IS-2 heavy tanks. Their 122mm main guns fired shells that could blast straight through a concrete wall. When they struck German armour, the enemy tanks didn't just die, they disintegrated. Red Army infantry, armed with PPSH submachine guns, poured through the gaps. Their drums' magazines clicked and clattered, spitting death at close quarters. Some carried flamethrowers, and when they lit up, entire rooms became infernos. Each building became its own war. Stairwells were death traps. Cellars collapsed. Sergeant Antonov, still pushing forward now in Friedrichshain, described the fighting like this. We entered an apartment block. The wallpaper was yellow with flowers. A piano sat overturned in the hallway. On the third floor, we took fire from the bathroom. One of our men kicked in the door. There was an old woman, dead, cradling a Panzerfaust. She had fired it herself. Even the civilians were fighting, or trying to. Some handed out maps to Soviet troops, desperate to be spared. Others threw grenades from balconies. The Soviet response varied. Some units offered chocolate and bread to frighten children. Others took their vengeance in terrible ways. Berliners had long feared the Red Army's arrival. Rumours had spread like rot. Now those rumours had form. Looting was rampant. Worse followed. Women from the very young to the very old were raped, not by one man, but sometimes by dozens. Soviet command issued orders against it, but the tide of violence couldn't be stopped. Too many soldiers had lost too much. Too many had seen their homes destroyed, their families slaughtered by Germans. This was payback, rage without rules. Down in the Führerbunker, time was dissolving. Hitler's personal physician, Dr. Morell, had been dismissed. The atmosphere turned sickly. Cigarette smoke clung to the concrete walls. Sleep was rare. Meals were taken in silence. On 28th April, word reached the bunker. Himmler had tried to negotiate peace with the Western Allies. Hitler exploded with fury. The betrayal confirmed what many around him already suspected. The dream was dead. But the Führer refused to surrender. Instead, he married Eva Braun in the early hours of 29th of April. The ceremony lasted minutes. Champagne was served. The mood, like a funeral. That same day, Soviet troops reached the Tiergarten. The inner sanctum of the Nazi regime was now within artillery range. They could see the Reichstag dome through the smoke. The Reichstag, once the seat of German democracy, later gutted by fire and Nazi ambition, had become the symbolic target. It was not a military command centre, but it had weight, meaning, and Stalin wanted it taken. Zhukov knew raising the red flag above the Reichstag would be a message to the world, to history. On the 30th of April, the 150th and 171st Rifle Divisions stormed the Reichstag under heavy fire. SS diehards and foreign volunteers, French, Dutch, Scandinavian, had fortified the building with sandbags, barbed wire, and machine gun nests. The fighting was apocalyptic. Inside the building, corridors were pitch black, filled with smoke and the crack of rifle fire. Grenades bounced down stairwells. Flame-lit shadows danced on marble walls. One Soviet soldier, armed with nothing but a bayonet and sidearm, described it as fighting inside a burning tomb. Eventually, in the evening light, two Red Army soldiers, Mikhail Yegorov and Meliton Kantaria, climbed onto the rooftop. They planted the victory banner, the red Soviet flag, on the shattered dome. The photo that would become iconic was taken later, staged, touched up. But the act itself was real. The flag was up, and below the bunker was silent. At around 3:30 p.m. on April 30th, Adolf Hitler shot himself in the head. Eva Braun took poison. Their bodies were carried into the garden above and burned with petrol, as instructed. The flames hissed in the spring air. Soviet shells landed nearby. No one knew, yet, that the dictator was dead. But the war was ending. Even with Hitler gone, the fighting continued. SS units, foreign legions and fanatics held out in isolated pockets. On May 1st, General Helmuth Weidling, Berlin's defence commander, attempted to negotiate surrender. But confusion reigned. Some units never received the order. Others refused. There was a final death spasm on the morning of the 2nd of May. Sporadic gunfire. A few last explosions. Then silence. Berlin had fallen. The guns had fallen silent. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough. Enough to know it was over. The city that once ruled over a continent now lay flat, bruised, smouldering, buried under its own ambition. Berlin had fallen, and with it the Third Reich was dead. In the early hours of 2 May, General Weidling officially surrendered the garrison of Berlin to the Red Army. The city's defenders, those who had not fled, died or been captured, laid down their arms. Soviet officers, many barely out of their 20s, accepted surrender from grizzled German colonels who looked like they'd aged a decade in a week. Some Wehrmacht units melted away into the ruins. Others assembled in open squares, stacking rifles in neat piles, unsure whether they'd be fed or shot. Soviet soldiers stood by in silence, smoking, watching, occasionally spitting into the dust. For Berlin's civilians, the end brought no relief, only exhaustion and fear. Women and children emerged from cellars, blinking into daylight that didn't seem to belong to them anymore. They stepped over rubble and corpses. Streets were lined with craters. Windows were shattered. The stink of death, sour, chemical, almost sweet, clung to every wall. The water lines were broken, sewage overflowed. Food had run out days ago. Babies cried constantly, or not at all. Both were terrifying. In some districts, Soviet troops handed out tinned meat and bread. In others, they took what they wanted. There were no rules, only moments. Some kind, many cruel. Mass graves were dug across the city, in schoolyards, in public parks, alongside canals. Civilians and captured German soldiers were made to bury the dead, Soviet and German alike. The ground was too hard in places, the stench too thick in others. Many were left unburied for days. Carts piled with bodies rolled slowly through the streets. Soldiers gagged behind their scarves. Rats swarmed. In the Tiergarten, once a garden of statues and promenades, the trees were splintered, blackened, leafless. The air buzzed with flies. The Battle of Berlin lasted just over 2 weeks, but in that time, more than 80,000 Soviet troops were killed or wounded. It was one of the costliest battles ever fought by the Red Army. A final price for a victory that had taken 4 long years to earn. German losses are harder to count. Military casualties likely exceeded 90,000. Civilian deaths, between 22,000 and 25,000, though some estimates reach higher. And yet these numbers, colossal though they are, fail to capture the magnitude of the ruin. It wasn't just a city that fell. It was an idea, a regime, a nightmare. Among the Soviets, the mood was complex. There was celebration, yes. Vodka flowed, songs were sung, flags were waved. But there was also silence, grief, exhaustion. Most of the soldiers who marched into Berlin had come from towns and villages that no longer existed. Their homes had been razed, their families killed. Some had fought since 1941 without rest. For many, it wasn't joy they felt, it was release. The war was over, they were still breathing. That was enough. Private Dmitry Mikhailovich, aged 19, wrote to his sister 2 days after the city fell. Berlin is made of stone and ghosts. I saw a little girl, maybe 6, standing barefoot next to a dead horse. She was holding a doll made of rags. I gave her chocolate. She stared at me like I wasn't real. Maybe I'm not. His letter never arrived. He was killed by a sniper on 7th May, one of the final casualties of the war in Europe. On the 7th of May in Reims, France, and again on the 8th of May in Karlshorst, Berlin, Nazi Germany signed its unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was officially over. 8 May 1945 became Victory in Europe Day. In London, crowds flooded Trafalgar Square, dancing and singing under Union Jacks. In Paris, bells rang from every cathedral. In New York, Times Square erupted in a sea of hats and handkerchiefs. But in Berlin, there was silence. Just smoke and silence. Almost immediately, Berlin was carved up. The Soviets took the eastern half. The Americans, British and French divided the West. What followed was not peace, but preparation for another kind of war. The Cold War. The Iron Curtain would fall. A wall would rise. And Berlin, the symbol of collapse, would become a symbol of defiance. In the months after the battle, the world turned to justice. The Nuremberg trials would begin. Crimes exposed, evidence presented, the faces of evil made plain. But justice was uneven. Many Nazis escaped. Many Soviets went unpunished for their own atrocities. War does not end cleanly, nor does peace begin honestly. The Battle of Berlin was not just a military campaign, it was the conclusion of an era. The climactic moment in a conflict that had redrawn the map of the world. For the Soviets, it was vindication. For the Germans, humiliation. For the rest of Europe, it was the beginning of a long recovery. Berlin would be rebuilt, street by street, brick by brick. But for years, reminders lingered, bullet holes in the walls, memorial plaques on every corner, ruins left standing as scars. The German people, stunned by the revelations of the Holocaust, would enter a long period of reckoning, and historians would debate endlessly how it came to this. But the truth is not difficult. Power, left unchecked, consumes everything, and when the fire burns too hot, all that remains is ash. Berlin would become a Cold War flashpoint. Checkpoint Charlie. Airlifts. Espionage. Propaganda. And in 1961, the Berlin Wall, concrete, barbed wire, guard towers, severed the city once more. It would stand for 28 years, but when it fell in 1989, people danced on top of it, with hammers and hope. The city that had once symbolized tyranny became a place of reunion, a place of light. History has many faces. Sometimes it's a parade, sometimes it's a scream, and sometimes it's a whisper in the rubble. The Battle of Berlin was one of the most brutal, final and decisive chapters in the blood-soaked volume of the Second World War. It ended a regime, it saved lives, it took millions more, but above all, it reminds us that the cost of war is not measured in victories, but in the people who are left to carry the memory, in those who endured, in those who rebuilt, and in those who remember. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.